Hello everyone, welcome to my third lesson on political populism. I'm Henk de Burg, I'm a cultural theorist and a professor of German at the University of Sheffield. In the first two lessons I talked about the key features of political populism. What I want to do now is try and answer the question, how do populists get their message across? What, in other words, are the rhetorical strategies and even rhetorical tricks that they employ? Well, first of all, there's the use of emotive language. As will have become clear from the first two lessons, populism isn't really about stringently argued content. It's not about specific policy proposals. It's above all a form of opponentism, of being against something. And there, emotion works much better than a list of specific policy proposals, which, as I say, you don't want to do anyway. It works better than putting forward an argument, which, as I say, you don't really want to do anyway. Because let's face it, populism, as I said in my very first lesson, is really about, or one of the features of populism, is that it puts forward simplistic answers to what are really complex social problems. It's about decomplexifying social structures. It's about scapegoating. It's about othering the scapegoat, so painting a picture of, say, Mexican immigrants or immigrants like me from Holland, who weren't born in the UK, as being fundamentally other and therefore not part of the people. And the best way to get that message across is really through emotions, because that's really what populism is. It's a kind of a gut truth, the idea we've got all these problems, and what we have to do is we stop the boats, we kick out the foreigners, we deal with immigration, and then everything will be fine and dandy. This idea that actually, sadly, in politics, emotions work better than arguments, that's a very, very old idea. You can find it in classical antiquity. There's a very famous French writer, someone called Gustave Le Bon, who wrote a book about crowd psychology, and who makes this, who puts forward this famous idea that he phrases: "On domine plus facilement les peuples en excitant leur passion qu'en s'occupant de leurs intérêts." It's much easier to dominate the people, to get hold of them, to convince them, to persuade them by playing to their emotions than actually addressing their concerns. So if there's social problems, the best way to deal with that would be to actually address the social problems, but populists come up with these simplistic pseudo solutions. And the best way to then persuade the voter is through emotion. We see that in advertising as well, right? If there's hunger in Africa, what we see a clip against that, a television clip against that, they tend not to give you statistics. They tend actually also not even to give you a lot of information. What they do is very often you see a crying child and so on, right? So even these kind of adverts play to our emotions. All politicians do that, and populist politicians do that even more than ordinary politicians. So that's the first thing, the use of emotive language. The second rhetorical strategy that populists use is that they give their message an archetypal structure. The concept of the archetype goes back to the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, and it means that things, in this case, have sort of a fairy tale-like structure. So politics, that means in concrete terms that politics, populist politicians, see politics above all as a battle of good against evil, again, like in fairy tales, of brave outsiders against a corrupt establishment. The third rhetorical strategy that populists use is that they frame their message in terms of us and them. I already addressed this particular us and them thinking in my earlier lessons, right? So you have the construction of kind of a spurious us, the people, and then the populists as the voice of the people, as opposed to an equally fictitious them, other people, consisting of, I don't know, immigrants, people who were born elsewhere, and so on and so forth. The populist message is always one of us versus them, only those two groups. The fourth rhetorical strategy is the use of personal insults. And populist politicians, Donald Trump is of course a really good example, do this a lot more, a heck of a lot more than ordinary politicians. They constantly insult other people, and sometimes in quite excessive ways. Trump even insults judges, CEOs and so on, so people who aren't even politicians. And this links back to the decomplexification of society and social problems through personalization. I talked about that in my very first lesson. This is what populists do. The real social problems are to do not with structures, which are abstract and hard to get a handle on. The real problem are people and groups of people, Mexican immigrants, Polish plumbers, in the extreme case of National Socialism, the Jews. So personal insults aren't simply a sign of sort of a lack of sophistication on the part of the populist. They are a very deliberate rhetorical strategy to give the voters to the idea that the real problem are people, groups of people, and it's much easier to deal with people than it is with abstract social structures. What are some of the other rhetorical strategies that populists use? Well, there's the use of conspiracy theories, conspiracism. I talked about that in one of my earlier lessons. Then there is what some people have called constant or permanent electioneering, the business of outrage. Again, Donald Trump is a really good example here. Donald Trump is currently the American president. So you would think that now he's in power, he will above all try and put forward all sorts of legislative ideas, get his legislation through the House of Representatives and the Senate and so on. But still, actually, a lot of what Donald Trump is doing is, is still a kind of electioneering. He's still acting as if he were running for office rather than actually being the president. And this links back with this idea that I've spoken about before, which is that populists and populist parties aren't actually very good when it comes to the detail of policy. So that then puts them in a quandary when they are in power, because then they realize that all the things that they've always been against, endless or very long discussions with other politicians, trying to arrive at compromises, and that's all stuff that they don't really want to do. So what do they do instead in order to sort of satisfy their electorate? They keep acting as if they were still on election. They keep doing their various forms of opponentism, of againstism, rather than trying to put forward specific policy proposals, which of course they sometimes do. But that is not, with other politicians, that would be sort of the main focus, perhaps even the almost exclusive focus of what they're doing. In the case of populists, they keep insulting people, they keep saying things like this is bad and that is bad. So they continue their electioneering, they continue with what has been called the business of outrage. Political dog whistling. So dog whistling is the use of kind of a coded language. So you're not saying things directly, but indirectly in a kind of coded way, such that most voters won't or might not recognize what it is that you're sort of hinting at, but a specific group do recognize that you're what it is that you're saying. The phrase dog whistling comes from sheep herding. So sheep herders use a whistle that gives off a sound, a tone that is so high-pitched that their dogs can hear it, but not human beings and also not the sheep. So dog whistling, political dog whistling, is that kind of language where you hint at something. Very often it's kind of a racist or xenophobic subtext, which you don't literally say because, sometimes populists are, they don't want to be seen as overly racist, but they can hint at it, and they do that through dog whistling. And in my next lesson, we will look at a couple of examples. Then there is exaggeration. You listen to populist politicians and it all seems, way over the top. So you would think that a lot of people would say, well, this is so over the top, I can't take that seriously. But actually, that is not the reaction that quite a lot of voters have. they see that exaggeration as a kind of, as a sign, as proof of authenticity. Because if you think about it for a moment, this is how we talk, right? When we are with our friends, when we are with our family, we exaggerate all the time. So we say things like, oh, this new watch that I bought, best decision of my life. Now, obviously, that's highly unlikely, right? Buying a watch is not going to be the best decision of your life, but that's how we speak. Best decision of my life. Or this party, best party ever. Or we work as a barista and we say things like, this new boss I've got, he's worse than Stalin. Now, your new boss is not going to be worse than Stalin, right? But that is the way we speak when we are with our family and friends. The Italian political scientist Marco Marini has called this the language of the home. And populists talk in this language of the home, which is exaggerated. One of the reasons these rhetorical strategies work so well has got to do with the current media landscape. So it's really interesting. As I said in my very first lesson, the world has seen populist politicians and populist parties before, but it's really only in the last 1 or 2 decades that we see this global rise of populism. And a lot of that, I think, is to do with the media landscape and especially the social media landscape. First of all, we now tend to live in sort of echo chambers, right? In information bubbles. So in the past, I'm old enough to remember this, most people would watch the BBC News at 10:30 or whatever the time was, and that was it. Now there's a whole diversity of different news organizations that we can go to, and we do so on our mobile phones. So people can watch, say, CNN, which is kind of centrist, or they can watch, in an American context, a news organization that's more to the left, MSNBC. Or they can go more to the right and watch Fox News, or even more to the right, they can watch Breitbart News. Here people can still watch the BBC, but they can also watch the more conservative GB News. And we tend to select the kind of news outlet that fits the opinions and political views that we have already. So we are much less than in the past confronted with political views and views of society and so on, views of immigration, views of the nation that we don't agree with. And that is then, as we all know, and I'm sure you know this much better than me, I'm sure you're all much more media savvy, social media savvy than me. That has got a lot to do with algorithms, right? So I happen to be interested in watches, so every time I scroll through the news on my mobile phone, I get lots and lots of newspaper articles, social media stuff on wristwatches. But if you're really interested in immigration or anti-immigration, the algorithm, whether you're on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, the algorithm will send these anti-immigration messages or maybe pro-immigration messages to you. So the algorithmicization of the news, if that's even a word, tends to steer information and sometimes disinformation towards you that accords with what you already believe. So if you're inclined or if you're attracted to the populist message, then on your mobile phone you will get endless populist messages rather than sort of criticism of that. And that takes us to what I think is the most pernicious element of social media, which is that actually social media, because it's quick and short, right? So if you look at messages on Twitter, now called X, right? They're relatively short. You can't develop an article length, let alone a book length argument on Twitter. So Twitter or X lends itself perfectly, actually demands simplification. And that is precisely one of the key features of political populism, as we saw in the very first lesson. And then even more pernicious than that is that what works best on social media is sort of outrage, is exaggeration, is excess, right? So you're watching this lecture by me now. If you were to go on, I don't know, say X, and you were to tweet something like, watched a lecture by Englenberg, it was okay, no one's going to be interested in that, right? But if you tweet something like, this is the best lecture ever, MASSOLIT is the best, most fantastic company ever, you're going to get more views, you're going to get more clicks. And sadly, I'm not recommending this, but sadly, if you go negative, if you say this is the worst this or that ever, you will get even more clicks. There seems to be something with human psychology that makes us sort of more interested in negative messages, in disasters, in extreme insults, in any form of extremism than in sort of positivity. It doesn't mean that there's no positivity, never ever, there is, right? But most of social media, the big, the kind of things that give, that produce clicks and views is precisely when something is way over the top and exaggerated and extreme. And that is precisely, as I've explained, that is precisely kind of the message of political populism. There's binarism, there's exaggeration, there's simplification, and so on. So we live in an era where we see a number of politicians putting forward simplistic, sometimes xenophobic, racist messages, but that dovetails perfectly, sadly, with the way social media works. And that is why I think, well, one of the reasons anyway, why we're seeing so much political populism today, much more so than in the 1980s or the 1970s.